The day my daughter signed the papers to place me in a nursing home, there was something unsettling about how normal she acted like this was just another task to complete rather than a life-changing decision. And what stood out to me wasn't anger or hesitation, but the absence of both. The quiet confidence in her voice, the way she avoided lingering on anything emotional, as if she had already processed the entire situation long before I even realized it was happening. And I remember sitting there, watching her explain everything in calm, measured sentences, talking about comfort, safety, and what was best for me, while something deeper, something unspoken, sat behind every word she chose, something that didn't quite align with the picture she was trying to present. And in that moment I realized something important, not about her decision, but about the way it had been made. Because decisions like this don't appear suddenly. They build quietly over time, shaped by intentions that often remain hidden until it's too late to question them. And while she believed she was guiding the outcome carefully, placing me into a situation she had already justified in her mind, she had no idea that long before this day ever arrived, I had already stepped outside that outcome, entirely making a decision of my own that would eventually change everything she thought she had secured. It didn't begin with the paperwork or the visit to the nursing home. It began weeks earlier in conversations that seemed harmless on the surface, small remarks about my health, casual observations about how living alone might be getting harder, suggestions framed as concern rather than intention, and at first I didn't think much of it. Because that's how these things usually start, slowly, subtly, without any clear direction. But over time, those comments became more consistent, more structured, less like passing thoughts, and more like pieces of a larger narrative being carefully assembled. And I started to notice patterns in the way she spoke, the repetition of certain ideas, the way she would circle back to the same points as if reinforcing them, not just for me but for herself, building a sense of inevitability around something that hadn't yet been directly addressed. And that's when I began to listen differently, not just to what she was saying, but to how she was saying it, to the timing of her words, to the moments she chose to emphasize or avoid, and slowly, without confrontation or accusation, the picture became clearer, revealing an intention that extended beyond concern, something more calculated, something that had already moved past the stage of discussion and into the realm of decision. What made that realization more difficult wasn't the idea itself, but the way it unfolded. Because it wasn't presented as a single moment of clarity, it emerged gradually through details that didn't quite fit together at first, small inconsistencies that most people would overlook, but once noticed became impossible to ignore, and one of those details stood out more than the rest. Not because it was obvious, but because it kept returning in different forms in different conversations, in ways that felt intentional, even when they were framed as casual, and that detail was the house, the way she brought it up in conversations that weren't directly related. The way her questions shifted from general curiosity to specific interest, asking about ownership, about future plans, about things she had never shown concern for before, and the more it came up, the harder it became to dismiss as coincidence, because patterns don't form without reason. And once a pattern reveals itself, it begins to shape everything around it, changing the way you interpret even the smallest details, until what once seemed unrelated becomes part of a much larger understanding. At that point I had a choice. I could confront her, question her intentions, directly force the conversation into the open, where everything would have to be explained, justified, possibly denied, or I could do something else entirely, something quieter. Something that didn't rely on immediate answers, but instead allowed the situation to unfold naturally, revealing more than any confrontation ever could. And I chose the latter, not because I was avoiding the truth, but because I understood that truth, when rushed, often becomes distorted, shaped by defense rather than honesty. And I didn't want a version of the truth that had been adjusted to fit a narrative. I wanted to see it as it really was, without interference, without pressure, and that meant stepping back, observing, allowing her to continue without realizing that I had already begun to understand what she was doing, and in that space, in that silence, more became visible than she ever intended to show. Because once you stop reacting, you start seeing clearly, and what I saw wasn't just concern or practicality. It was preparation, the kind that doesn't happen overnight, the kind that builds over time through small, deliberate steps that seem insignificant on their own, but form a clear direction when viewed together, and that direction was no longer uncertain, it was leading somewhere specific. Somewhere, she had already decided I needed to go, and once I understood that everything else shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone else, but internally, in the way I processed every conversation, every suggestion, every decision that followed. Because now I wasn't just part of the situation, I was aware of it, and awareness changes everything. It turns confusion into clarity, hesitation into intention, and most importantly, it gives you the ability to act in a way that isn't driven by reaction, but by understanding. And that's when I realized she wasn't the only one making plans. The decision I made didn't come from anger or a desire to retaliate. It came from something much simpler, a need to ensure that what I had built over the years wouldn't become part of something I didn't agree with. Something that didn't reflect the intention behind it, and that required a level of clarity that can only come when emotion is set aside long enough to see the situation as it truly is, not as you wish it to be. And once I reached that point, the path forward became clear. Not easy, but clear. And sometimes that's enough, because clarity doesn't remove difficulty, but it gives you direction. And direction is what allows you to move forward without doubt. So before she ever mentioned the nursing home directly, I had already made my decision. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate thought through carefully to ensure that once it was done, it couldn't be easily undone or questioned. Because the effectiveness of a decision like this doesn't come from secrecy alone. It comes from finality, from the understanding that by the time it's discovered, it's already too late to change. And that's exactly what I needed, not control over her actions, but control over the outcome. Something that would exist outside her influence entirely. Something she wouldn't even think to question until the moment it mattered most. The moment she finally brought up the nursing home directly, it wasn't presented as a question or even a suggestion, but rather as a carefully structured solution to a problem she had already defined on my behalf, and the way she explained it carried a quiet certainty that made it clear she wasn't expecting resistance. She spoke about safety, about convenience, about how everything would be taken care of. And I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I recognized the effort she had put into making this sound reasonable, almost inevitable, as if she had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, multiple times refining it, until it no longer sounded like a decision she was making, but one that had somehow already been made by circumstances themselves. And what struck me most wasn't the content of what she was saying, but the absence of doubt in how she said it, because doubt is what usually leaves space for discussion, but there was no space here. Only a clear path forward that she believed I would eventually accept, and in that moment I understood that this wasn't just about where I would live. It was about control, about who was shaping the direction of my life moving forward, and while she believed that control was firmly in her hands, I had already taken steps to ensure that the outcome she expected would not unfold the way she imagined. I didn't argue with her, didn't question her logic, didn't challenge the assumptions she had built her decision on, because doing so would have only shifted the conversation into a defensive space where explanations replace honesty, and I wasn't interested in hearing a version of the truth that had been adjusted to justify an outcome. Instead, I chose something far more effective. I agreed, not fully, not genuinely, but enough to allow the situation to move forward without resistance, because sometimes the most powerful position you can take isn't opposition, but alignment, especially when that alignment gives you the time and space to act without interference, and that's exactly what I needed. Time to ensure that the decision I had already made would remain intact, untouched by whatever came next, and as she continued to explain the benefits, the logistics, the ease of the transition, I nodded occasionally, offering just enough acknowledgement to reinforce her belief that everything was going according to plan, while internally I was simply observing how confidently she was walking toward an outcome that no longer existed. In the days that followed, her behavior shifted in subtle but noticeable ways, as if the act of saying it out loud had transformed the idea into something concrete, something that now required action rather than discussion, and I could see it in the way she spoke, in the way her tone carried a sense of progress, as though she had already crossed an important threshold and was now focused on completing what she had started. And with that shift came a new level of organization. Appointments were scheduled, calls were made, Details were arranged with a level of efficiency that suggested this wasn't something she was figuring out as she went, but something she had already thought through in advance, and I watched it all unfold with a quiet awareness that made every step she took feel slightly detached from reality. Not because it didn't make sense on the surface, but because I knew something she didn't, something that would eventually reshape everything she was working toward, and that knowledge created a strange kind of calm. The kind that comes from understanding that while someone else believes they are in control, the true outcome has already been decided elsewhere. There was a moment, a brief one, when she asked me if I was okay with everything, and the way she asked it felt more like a formality than a genuine question, as if she needed the confirmation not to guide her decision, but to validate it, to reassure herself that what she was doing was acceptable. And I could have used that moment to shift everything, to introduce doubt, to force a deeper conversation. But I didn't, because by then I understood that her need for validation was part of the process she had built, and disrupting that process wouldn't change the outcome, it would only complicate it. And instead I gave her the answer. She expected a simple acknowledgement that allowed her to continue without hesitation, and in doing so I reinforced the illusion that everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned, while in reality the foundation of that plan had already been altered in a way she couldn't yet see. The visit to the nursing home was arranged quickly, almost as if the sooner it happened, the easier it would be to finalize everything without second thoughts. And when we arrived, she moved through the place with a level of focus that suggested she was evaluating it, not just as a living space for me, but as a solution. She needed to confirm, asking questions, noting details, engaging with the staff in a way that reflected both concern and determination, and I followed quietly, observing not just the environment, but her reactions to it, the way she responded to certain answers, the way she seemed to relax as each requirement she had in mind was met, and it became clear that this wasn't just about finding a suitable place. It was about ensuring that every part of her decision could be justified both to herself and to anyone else who might question it. And as she moved closer to that confirmation, her confidence grew, reinforcing the belief that everything was aligning exactly as it should, unaware that the most important element in her plan was no longer where she thought it was. When the paperwork was finally placed in front of her, she didn't hesitate, not even for a moment, as if the act of signing was simply the final step in a process that had already been completed in her mind. And I watched as she reviewed the documents briefly, more out of routine than uncertainty, before committing to the decision with a steady hand. And there was something definitive about that moment, something that marked a clear transition from intention to action, from planning to execution. And once it was done, there was no sense of pause or reflection, only a quiet satisfaction that everything had been handled, that the situation was now resolved in a way that made sense to her. And I allowed that moment to exist exactly as it was, because interfering with it would have served no purpose. The decision she believed she had finalized was already disconnected from the outcome she expected, and the only thing left was time for that realization to surface in a way that couldn't be ignored or undone. The days leading up to the move were filled with activity. But it wasn't chaotic or emotional. It was structured, organized in a way that reflected her approach to the entire situation, each step planned, each detail accounted for, and while there were moments where she attempted to frame it as something positive, something beneficial, there was an underlying urgency in the way she moved from one task to the next, as if completing everything quickly would prevent any complications from arising, and I played my role in that process without resistance, allowing her to guide the pace, to make the decisions, to feel the sense of control she believed she had, and in doing so I ensured that nothing interfered with the sequence of events she had set in motion, because the smoother everything appeared on the surface, the more impactful the shift would be when it finally came. And that shift was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The actual move was quieter than I expected, not because it lacked significance, but because it had been stripped of any emotional weight, reduced to a series of practical steps that needed to be completed, boxes packed, items sorted, decisions made about what would come with me and what would stay behind, and through it all she maintained the same composed demeanor, focused on efficiency rather than reflection, as if treating the situation as a task would make it easier to manage, and I didn't challenge that approach. Didn't try to slow things down or draw attention to what was happening, because by then the physical act of moving had become secondary to something much larger, something that had already been set in motion long before the first box was packed, and as I watched my belongings being divided, categorized, relocated. I understood that while she believed she was organizing my life into a new structure, the most important part of that life had already been removed from her reach entirely. When everything was finally in place and the move was complete, there was a brief moment of stillness. The kind that usually invites reflection, but she didn't linger in it. Instead, she shifted quickly into reassurance, explaining how everything would work, how often she would visit, how this arrangement would ultimately be better for both of us, and I listened without interruption. Not because I needed to hear it, but because she needed to say it, needed to reinforce the narrative she had built around this decision, and as she spoke, I could see the certainty returning, the same confidence that had guided her from the beginning, strengthened now by the fact that everything had been carried out exactly as she intended, and in that moment she truly believed that the situation was resolved, that the outcome was secure, that there were no remaining variables that could change what she had set in motion, and that belief, more than anything else, is what made what came next unavoidable, because the one variable she never considered was already gone. The first few nights in the nursing home carried a strange kind of quiet, not the peaceful kind that brings comfort, but the kind that forces you to notice everything you've been avoiding. And as I sat there surrounded by unfamiliar walls and routines that had been decided for me rather than by me, I could feel the weight of the transition settling in, not as regret, but as awareness. Because every major change reveals something that smaller moments tend to hide, and in that space with nothing left to distract me, I began to see the full picture more clearly, not just the decision she had made, but the process behind it, the way it had been built step by step, gradually shifting from concern to convenience, from conversation to conclusion. And what stood out most wasn't the outcome itself, but how naturally it had been accepted, how easily something so significant had been reframed as something necessary, and that realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity, the kind that removes any lingering doubt about what needed to be done next, even if that step had already been taken long before this moment arrived. Adjusting to the routine wasn't difficult in a physical sense. Everything was structured, predictable, designed to remove uncertainty. But that structure also made something else more visible, the absence of personal choice, the subtle but constant reminder that decisions were now being made externally rather than internally. And while many people might resist that shift immediately, I didn't, not because I accepted it, but because I understood that resistance at this stage wouldn't change anything. It would only create noise around something that had already been set in motion, and instead I focused on observation, on understanding the environment, the people within it, the patterns that defined each day. Because understanding a situation fully is often more valuable than reacting to it prematurely. And in that understanding I found a certain level of control, not over the circumstances themselves, but over how I moved within them, and that distinction, small as it may seem, makes all the difference. Her visits, when they happened, followed a predictable pattern, short-structured and carefully balanced between attentiveness and distance, as if she was fulfilling a responsibility while also maintaining a boundary that allowed her to keep the situation emotionally manageable. And I could see the effort in that balance, the way she chose her words, the way she framed each conversation to keep it focused on reassurance rather than reflection. And I didn't disrupt that pattern, didn't push for deeper conversations, or challenge the way she approached it, because by then I understood that her behavior wasn't random. It was intentional, shaped by the narrative she had created to justify her decisions, and challenging that narrative directly wouldn't lead to clarity. It would only lead to defensiveness, and defensiveness rarely reveals the truth. It protects it. There were moments during those visits where she would mention the house casually, almost as an afterthought, bringing it into the conversation in a way that felt natural but carried a deeper significance, talking about small changes, minor updates. Things that suggested she was becoming more comfortable in that space, more connected to it, and I listened carefully to those details, not because I needed to know what she was doing, but because of what those details revealed about her mindset, the growing sense of ownership. The quiet confidence that came from believing that everything was unfolding according to her expectations, and that confidence was important not because it strengthened her position, but because it delayed her awareness, allowing the situation to develop exactly as it needed to without interruption. The more she spoke about the house, the clearer it became that in her mind it was no longer something temporary or shared. It was something she was already integrating into her future, making plans around it, thinking beyond the present moment, and that shift in perspective is subtle but significant. Because once something becomes part of your future, your decisions begin to align with it, automatically reinforcing the belief that it belongs there. And that's exactly what was happening. She wasn't just maintaining the house, she was positioning herself within it, building a sense of permanence that felt real to her, even though its foundation had already been removed, and the more that sense of permanence grew, the more difficult the eventual realization would be. There was no urgency from my side. No need to accelerate anything or bring the truth forward before its time, because timing, more than action, determines the impact of a situation, and revealing something too early often reduces its effect, while allowing it to unfold naturally ensures that when it does surface, it carries its full weight. And that's why I remain patient, allowing her to move forward at her own pace, to build her understanding based on her assumptions, because only then would the contrast between what she believed and what was real become undeniable. From a distance, through quiet updates and indirect observations, I could sense how deeply she had settled into that belief, how confidently she moved within it, and that confidence wasn't forced. It was genuine, built over time through repetition and reinforcement, and that's what made it so effective. Because when a belief feels natural, it's rarely questioned. It becomes the default perspective through which everything else is interpreted. And once that happens, even obvious inconsistencies can be overlooked, dismissed as minor issues rather than signs of something larger. But reality has a way of surfacing, not all at once, not in a way that announces itself clearly, but gradually, through small disruptions that begin to challenge what once felt certain, and those disruptions had already started to appear, not enough to force immediate recognition, but enough to create a subtle tension beneath the surface, a feeling that something wasn't aligning perfectly, even if it couldn't yet be defined. And that's how awareness begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. She hadn't reached that point yet, but she was moving toward it step by step, guided by the very confidence that had allowed her to move forward so easily in the beginning. And that's the paradox of situations like this. The same certainty that enables progress can also delay realization, keeping you committed to a path long after its foundation has shifted, and by the time that shift becomes visible, you're already deeply invested in the outcome you expect. And the deeper she stepped into that belief, the harder it would be to accept what was already waiting for her. In the weeks after I settled into the nursing home, everything appeared exactly the way she had envisioned it, structured, predictable, and controlled, the kind of environment she believed would quietly solve a problem she no longer wanted to manage directly, and for a while it worked. At least on the surface, because she continued her routine, visiting occasionally, calling just enough to maintain the appearance of involvement, and each interaction carried the same tone of reassurance, as if she needed to confirm repeatedly that the decision she had made was still the right one. And I responded in a way that supported that belief, calm, cooperative, never introducing doubt or resistance, allowing her to exist comfortably within the version of reality she had created. And while she focused on maintaining that structure, her attention gradually shifted elsewhere, toward the space she had truly been preparing for all along the house, the place that represented not just property, but control, stability, and a future she believed she had already secured. And it was in that shift of focus that the first real crack began to form, not in her plan itself, but in her understanding of it. At first her interactions with the house were subtle, almost cautious, as if she was stepping into something she wanted to feel like her own, but hadn't fully claimed yet, making small changes, adjusting things gradually, testing the space in a way that allowed her to grow comfortable without confronting the reality of what she was doing too directly. And over time that hesitation faded, replaced by a growing sense of ownership that influenced her decisions more confidently, rearranging furniture, organizing documents, making plans that extended beyond the present moment. And from the outside it would have looked completely normal, like a natural transition from one phase of life to another. But what she didn't realize was that every step she took deeper into that sense of ownership was built on an assumption that no longer held any truth, an assumption that had already been quietly removed from the foundation of everything she was doing. And because that removal had happened without her awareness, there was no immediate resistance, no warning, only a gradual progression toward a realization that would eventually disrupt everything she believed she had under control. The first sign that something wasn't quite right didn't come as a shock or a dramatic discovery. It came as a small inconsistency, the kind that most people would overlook or dismiss without much thought. A detail that didn't align perfectly with what she expected, but didn't seem significant enough to question deeply. And at first that's exactly what she did. She noticed it, acknowledged it briefly, and then moved on. Assuming it was nothing more than a minor oversight or a misunderstanding that could be easily corrected, but what she didn't realize was that inconsistencies don't appear without reason. They are often the first visible signs of something much larger, something that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And the more she continued to interact with the house, the more those small details began to accumulate, not in a way that was obvious or overwhelming, but enough to create a subtle sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't entirely as it should be, even if she couldn't yet define exactly what that was. As those inconsistencies began to repeat, her approach started to shift slowly, at first almost unconsciously moving from casual interaction to a more deliberate form of attention, revisiting details she had previously ignored, checking things more carefully, trying to align what she was seeing with what she believed to be true. And this is where the tension began to build, not because anything had been revealed yet, but because the certainty she had relied on from the beginning was starting to weaken, replaced by a quiet uncertainty that she wasn't fully ready to confront, and instead of addressing it directly, she attempted to reinforce her original assumptions, convincing herself that everything was still in place, that whatever felt off could be explained or corrected. But the more she tried to restore that sense of certainty, the more fragile it became, because certainty built on incorrect assumptions cannot hold indefinitely, and eventually it begins to collapse under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, I remained exactly where she had placed me, observing everything from a distance, not through direct involvement, but through the quiet awareness that comes from understanding how a situation is unfolding without needing to control it, and there was a certain clarity in that distance. A perspective that allowed me to see the progression of her actions without being caught in them, and while she moved forward with growing uncertainty, I remained steady, not because I was unaffected, but because I had already accepted the outcome long before she even approached it. And that acceptance created a kind of calm that contrasted sharply with the tension she was beginning to experience, because while she was moving toward a realization she didn't yet understand, I had already reached the end of that path, and all that remained was for her to arrive there as well. The moment she decided to review the documents again didn't come from panic, but from a need to restore control, to confirm that everything was still aligned with her expectations. And this is often how realization begins, not with a sudden shock, but with a quiet attempt to reassure oneself that nothing has changed. And as she went through the paperwork, checking details she had previously overlooked, there was still a part of her that expected everything to match, to confirm the narrative she had been operating under. But reality doesn't adjust itself to match expectations. It simply exists, waiting to be acknowledged. And as she moved deeper into those documents, that expectation began to unravel, not all at once but in stages, each detail pulling her further away from the certainty she had relied on, and closer to something she hadn't prepared for, because the truth wasn't hidden. It was simply not what she expected to find. The name on the ownership records was the first thing that truly disrupted her understanding, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't hers, and for a moment there was hesitation, an attempt to reinterpret what she was seeing, to find an explanation that would align it with what she believed to be true. But the more she looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake, not a temporary detail or an oversight, but a definitive change. Something that had already been finalized and recorded in a way that couldn't be easily reversed or dismissed, and that's when the realization began to take shape slowly but undeniably, forcing her to confront the possibility that the foundation of everything she had been working toward no longer existed. The house was no longer mine. And that realization didn't just change one detail. It reshaped everything, every decision she had made, every assumption she had relied on. Every step she had taken with the belief that it was leading her toward a specific outcome, because once the foundation shifts, everything built on top of it must be reevaluated, and in that moment the certainty she had carried from the beginning collapsed entirely, replaced by a confusion that couldn't be resolved through simple explanation or adjustment, because this wasn't a minor inconsistency, it was a complete reversal of what she thought was true. The more she searched for answers, the more evident it became that this wasn't recent. It hadn't happened after the move. It hadn't been a reaction to her decision. It had been done before long, before the nursing home was ever mentioned, and that timing changed everything because it meant that while she believed she was planning ahead, securing her position, making decisions that would define the future, the most important decision had already been made without her knowledge, removing the very thing she thought she was working toward. And that's when the full weight of it began to settle in. Not just the fact that the house was no longer part of her future, but the realization that it had never been, not in the way she imagined, because the assumption she had been operating under wasn't just incorrect, it was irrelevant, and coming to terms with that kind of shift isn't immediate. It doesn't happen in a single moment of clarity. It unfolds gradually, forcing you to revisit everything you thought you understood and see it in a completely different light. Because I didn't lose the house, I chose where it would go. That decision, the one she had never seen, had been made with a clarity she hadn't expected from me, a level of awareness she hadn't accounted for. And that's what made it so effective, not just the act itself, but the timing, the fact that it existed completely outside her plan, beyond her influence. And by the time she discovered it, there was nothing left to change, nothing left to claim, only the reality of what had already been done. And in that reality, everything shifted not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of understanding. Because now she had to confront something far more difficult than losing a house. She had to confront the fact that she had misjudged the situation entirely, that the control she believed she had was never real, and that the outcome she had been working toward had already been decided without her. I didn't need to explain it to her, didn't need to justify my decision, or present it in a way that would make it easier to accept, because some realizations don't require explanation. They exist on their own, complete and undeniable, and anything added to them only distracts from their impact. And this was one of those moments where the truth spoke clearly enough without any additional words. And that's when she understood this was never her plan, because a plan only works when all its assumptions are true, and once those assumptions collapse, what remains isn't a plan. It's a series of actions that no longer lead anywhere, and that's exactly where she found herself standing in the middle of something she had built, only to realize that its outcome had already been removed. The control she thought she had wasn't taken from her in that moment. It had never been there to begin with, and recognizing that is far more difficult than losing something tangible, because it forces you to question not just what happened, but how you understood it in the first place. And by the time she fully realized it, there was nothing left to take. The moment the reality fully settled in, it didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, in the kind of silence that forces you to sit with what you just discovered, and I imagine that for her. That silence felt heavier than any argument ever could, because there was no one to blame in that moment, no immediate reaction to push against, only the undeniable truth of what had already been done. And that kind of realization doesn't just affect what you thought you had. It reshapes how you see everything that led up to it, every decision, every assumption, every step that once felt certain, now requiring reevaluation, and as she stood there going over the same details again and again, hoping to find something she had missed, something that would restore the version of reality she had been operating under, it became increasingly clear that there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to correct, because the situation hadn't changed. Suddenly, it had been this way all along. She had simply been unaware of it. And awareness, once it arrives, cannot be undone. It stays forcing you to confront not just the outcome but the path that led you there. In the days that followed, her actions likely shifted from certainty to urgency, not the confident, structured urgency she had shown before, but a different kind. One driven by the need to regain control over something that no longer responded to her efforts, reaching out, asking questions, trying to understand when it had happened, how it had happened, and most importantly, why? Because without that understanding, the situation would remain incomplete in her mind. an unresolved problem that didn't follow the logic she had relied on. And that's the difficult part about moments like this. They don't just disrupt your plans, they challenge your perspective, forcing you to recognize that the way you interpreted things wasn't as accurate as you believed. And that recognition doesn't come easily. It resists. It looks for alternatives, for explanations that feel more acceptable, but the truth doesn't change based on comfort. It remains exactly as it is, regardless of how it's received. She may have tried to contact me not immediately, not in a calm or composed way, but after enough time had passed for the initial shock to turn into something more focused, more intentional, a need to hear directly from me to get answers that documents and records couldn't fully provide. And I knew that moment would come, not because I expected confrontation, but because unresolved situations naturally move toward closure, and for her that closure required understanding something she had never anticipated, and when that call finally came, it wasn't the tone of anger I might have expected, but something more controlled, more measured, as if she was holding back the full weight of her reaction in order to maintain some level of composure. And I answered with the same calm I had maintained throughout, not defensive, not confrontational, simply present, because by that point there was nothing left to argue about. The situation had already reached its conclusion. The questions she asked weren't complicated, but they carried the weight of everything she had just realized. When did you do this? Why didn't you tell me? How could you make a decision like this without involving me? And each question reflected not just confusion, but a deeper sense of displacement, as if the role she believed she had in shaping the future had been quietly removed without her knowledge. And I listened to those questions without interruption, allowing them to fully exist before responding, because the answers weren't meant to justify my actions or soften their impact. They were meant to reflect the reality of the situation as it truly was. And when I finally spoke, I didn't offer long explanations or emotional reasoning. I simply told her the truth, that I had made the decision when I realized that the direction she was moving in no longer included me in a way I recognized, and that once I understood that it became clear what I needed to do. There was a pause after that, not a short one, but the kind that signals something deeper than disagreement, a moment where the weight of what was said begins to settle in not just as information but as understanding, and in that pause I could sense the shift. The movement from questioning the situation to recognizing it, and that recognition is what changes everything, because once you understand something clearly, you can no longer approach it the same way you can't return to the assumptions you had before. You can't pretend the outcome should be different. You're left with what is, and what is doesn't require agreement. It only requires acknowledgement, and that's what she was beginning to reach. Not acceptance. Not yet, but the first stage of it, where the truth is no longer something you're trying to change, but something you're starting to understand. I didn't tell her who the house had been given to, not because it was a secret, but because it no longer mattered in the way she thought it did. The significance wasn't in the new ownership. It was in the fact that the ownership had changed at all. That the assumption she had built everything on was no longer valid, and focusing on the details of where it went would only distract from that reality, and instead I allowed the conversation to remain centered on what had already been established. The fact that the decision had been made independently, deliberately, and at a time when she wasn't considering the possibility that such a decision could exist, and that was enough, more than enough, because sometimes clarity doesn't come from knowing every detail. It comes from understanding the one detail that changes everything. After that conversation there wasn't much left to say, not because everything had been resolved, but because the situation had moved beyond the point where words could alter it, and that's often how these moments end. Not with a dramatic conclusion or a clear resolution, but with a quiet understanding that what has been done cannot be undone, and that the only thing left is how you choose to move forward from it, and for her that path would likely involve re-evaluating not just the outcome, but the decisions that led to it, the assumptions that shaped those decisions, and the way she approached something that required more than just planning, more than just control. For me, the outcome wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about ensuring that what I had built remained aligned with the intention behind it, that it didn't become part of something that no longer reflected the values it was created with, and that required a level of detachment that isn't easy, but sometimes necessary. Because holding on to something simply because it exists can lead to outcomes that don't align with what you truly want, and letting go when done with clarity can be a form of control in itself, not over others, but over your own direction. The nursing home, which had once been presented as the final step in a carefully constructed plan, became something entirely different. Not a place of confinement or loss, but a space that existed outside the expectations that had been placed on it. And in that space, I found something unexpected. Not comfort in the traditional sense, but clarity, a distance from the situation that allowed me to see it fully without the pressure of reacting to it, and that clarity made it easier to accept everything that had happened, not because it was ideal, but because it was understood. And understanding, more than anything else, is what changes the way you carry an experience. It doesn't erase it, it doesn't justify it, but it places it in a context that allows you to move forward without being defined by it. And that's where I found myself not looking back with regret or forward with expectation, but simply existing in a space where everything had already been decided and there was nothing left to question. For her, the lesson would take longer to settle, not because it was unclear, but because it required a shift in perspective that doesn't happen immediately. Moving from a mindset of control to one of awareness, recognizing that decisions involving other people cannot be reduced to simple outcomes without considering the impact they carry, and that lesson, once understood, has the potential to change not just one situation, but every situation that follows. Because in the end, this was never just about a house or a place to live. It was about intention, about how decisions are made, and what they reveal about the people making them. And once those intentions are clear, the outcomes become less surprising, even if they are unexpected. She didn't lose the house in the way she might have first believed, because loss implies ownership, and ownership was never truly hers. What she lost was the assumption that things would unfold according to her plan without question, and that kind of loss is more difficult to process, because it challenges not just what happened, but how you understood it. An understanding, once changed, doesn't return to what it was before. It moves forward, reshaping the way you see things, the way you approach decisions, the way you interpret actions, and that shift, while difficult, is often where real growth begins. As for me, I didn't see it as the end of anything, not of a relationship, not of a chapter, but as a transition, one that had been necessary even if it wasn't comfortable, because sometimes the only way to preserve what matters is to step away from what threatens to change it. And in stepping away, I didn't lose control. I redefined it. Because control isn't about holding on to everything. It's about knowing what to let go of and when to do it. And once you understand that, the fear of losing something begins to fade, replaced by the confidence that comes from making decisions with clarity rather than reaction. She had made her decision believing it would define my future, but in the end it revealed something else entirely, not about me, but about her, about the way she approached responsibility, about the assumptions she made, and about the importance of understanding the full impact of a choice before acting on it. And by the time all of that became clear, there was nothing left to change. Because she didn't send me away, she just made sure I left before she could take anything at all.